Okay, so I'll tell you my story as it's the common to start in webinars, but also because it is so important to today's topic, and it's also how I got the ADHD diagnosis. Like Olivia mentioned previously, someone just suggested to me I may have it, and that came as a complete shock to me at the time, because usually when we think of ADHD kids, we think of kids who don't want to go to school, don't want to study, just want to play around, and sort of trouble. And I was the good kid. I was the good kid who got straight A's all the time. The only thing I didn't get A's in was sports. Actually, I couldn't do much in sports at all. And what I know now, I can attribute that to an extreme form of anxiety that I had growing up. But everything else, when it came to all other subjects, the school, I was very good at. So it came a bit of a surprise. But as we'll see later, there is a type of ADHD, as I'm sure you guys know, some of you know at least, which is the inattentive type, which actually it's very common that people actually quite good in school, and it's much harder to tell. So I'll just tell you the beginning of how it all started. At six years ago, someone told me that I was living the dream. I was living in central London at the time. I was working for Shell Corporation. I had a great salary. Everything was perfect on the outside. And at this point, most coaches and therapists stories that they were burned out and stressed out and they couldn't take it anymore. My story, very similar to what somebody else here mentioned, I think it was Olivia again, is that I was bored to death. Up until that point, I had been a consultant traveling to different countries to visit clients every week. And I was just too busy running around, running to clients. And when I moved to London and when I started working for Shell, it was a very laid back job, very overstaffed project that just gave us a lot of free time, literally 9 to 5. You know how it is in the UK. Everybody just goes for a drink at 5 p.m. and they're done, and they don't really worry about working too hard. And it was the first time I think ever that I had the time to just look at my life and think about it and realize that I didn't see any point in what I was doing. Also, up until that point, I was paying off student loans, and basically I was just busy working and paying off loans and things like that. And at that time, I had paid off all my loans. I had this perfect life on paper, and I had a lot of time when I was going to work, and I just had the time to look around and say, my God, this is meaningless. I'm not helping anyone. I'm not doing anything that I consider useful. I'm just, I'm helping a big company just, make more money. And it's just, it doesn't help anyone. I didn't see any meaning in it. I'm not contributing to anyone. And also that time, and that's how it relates to today's topic, I also got into a relationship with, without labeling, because I really don't like labels. It was a person who was quite manipulative. And after that relationship was over, it just broke down. It kind of continued they continued to manipulate even after it was over. And again, as you'll see later, us ADHD people do often contribute to relationships breaking down. And you'll see what I mean later on in the webinar. But, no matter how manipulative they were, I can't say it was entirely their fault. I would say it's both sides. But the whole thing led to a tremendous amount of stress. And I think it was just a time for me to have a wake-up call. I'm sure you guys, many of you have probably had a similar story, and you can type in the chat box if you have. When you're going on the wrong track, the universe would just give you something to tell you you're on the wrong track. You have to change course. You have to change direction. It will just give you a nudge. And usually that comes in the form of a tremendous challenge, whether that's personal or professional, or, some sort of a breakdown. And this is basically what I had. It was a year of extreme stress mostly because of the relationship and the way it evolved at the end and everything that happened following that. And some things that happened in my professional life, etc. And at some point, I found myself just being unable to think, to make basic decisions, because of the tremendous amount of stress I had. And it was then that someone suggested I had ADHD, which as I mentioned earlier, I thought that's absolutely crazy. How can I have ADHD when I was like the best student in school? But as I found out later, that does often happen. So just because you're good at work or you got great grades, it doesn't mean you don't have ADHD or ADHD tendencies. So anyway, long story short, I was willing to try anything at the time, and I did see a specialist. I did see a psychiatrist for ADHD, and I got diagnosed right away. And I was given medication at the time, which I found great. And I don't know if anyone here, I think we have only two people here who have it, and a couple who think they might have it. So if anyone has tried ADHD medication, if you want to share, you can put it in the chat box now. We can discuss that later. But yeah, I was put on medication, and also because of the anxiety, I also saw my GP, which, as you guys know, in the UK, they give you about 5 to 10 minutes of their time. And he diagnosed me with, I think it was generalized anxiety disorder, and he gave me SSRI medication. So I clicked the wrong way. So I had the full range of modern day medication. Ritalin, that's for ADHD. Sertraline or Zoloft in the US, that's for anxiety, and diazepam or Valium, that's essentially for when the anxiety was extreme. And also I had a few panic attacks, which again, we know today that a panic is often caused by suppressed feelings, by feeling that you're not going in the right direction, by feeling that you're stuck and you're just trying to get out and you can't, and you kind of hitting walls all around. So I was experiencing these panic attacks, ended up at the A&E a few times, or the emergency room for you guys in America. And that's what, they gave me diazepam, GP gave me sertraline, and ADHD psychiatrist gave me Ritalin. So I had a whole bouquet of modern day medication, which I stayed on for a few months. And at that time, I left my job at Shell. Actually, around that time, I left my job at Shell. And before I had all this medication, I couldn't function. I couldn't make simple decisions. I couldn't apply for new jobs. I couldn't do any sort of math tests at corporates, or at least in my former field, they often have. I basically couldn't function. When I was put on the medication, I was like superwoman. I was rocking and rolling. I found a new job, got 20% salary increase compared to my previous job. And I was like superwoman. I could do everything. So I will talk about medication further on, but it can be good. Medication, in my opinion today, is that it should be a temporary help, and it can be great, but also if you stay on it forever, it can give you a false sense of confidence, false sense of that everything is okay. And I know a lot of people choose to stay like that. I mean, again, I would wake up feeling kind of down and not focused and anxious. And when I took the Ritalin, that is essentially a dopamine booster, very similar to cocaine and non-prescription amphetamines. So this is essentially what we are prescribing for ADHD, amphetamines. You might as well give people drugs. So this is what Ritalin is. Sertraline is an SSRI, which increases serotonin, which makes you calmer, happier. Diazepam, which I was taking occasionally when I had the panic attacks, is basically, as you guys, I'm sure you know, is a benzo, which is basically, again, makes you calmer, softer, muscle relaxant as well. So with this combination, within a half an hour of starting my day, I'll be rocking and rolling again. I'll be feeling great. And I had a new job and everything was great for a little while. However, one day I remember sitting in my beautiful apartment in central London. I was thinking, I don't want to spend the rest of my life on this, what I called life support. It's not me, it's a life support that's giving me this sense of, you, I can do everything I want. I'm calm and relaxed and and happy and motivated to do things. So I started looking for solutions again. And my friend who first suggested that I get diagnosed with ADHD found another psychiatrist and who was also a psychologist and also worked with alternative approaches, namely EFT, emotional freedom technique, like some of us here practicing. Similar to, well, not similar to RTT, but very effective for trauma. So he was a trauma specialist and an ADHD specialist, which, as you see later on, is the perfect combination. Extremely good professional in London who I went to see. And that's when I started working on, when he heard my whole life story, he suggested I have a trauma I need to resolve. It was a trauma from my kind of later, it wasn't even a childhood trauma. It was from later on, but that's what he heard. That's what he's noticed in my story. And by the way, when I first entered his office and started telling him my story, I started with, my life has been defined by boredom. So very typical for people with ADHD, until they find their niche, their area, and start following their passion, they will be bored. They'll be doomed to boredom as long as they don't follow their passion. Okay, so let me know if you agree. Once again, if you think you have ADHD or you have officially been diagnosed, it doesn't matter to me. It's many people out there suspect they might have it and are not diagnosed, and it really doesn't make a difference. And we'll talk about that again. So I went to see this person. We started working on a trauma, and once that shifted through EFT, I felt so different. I wanted to share this experience with the world. At the time, I didn't even think about becoming a therapist myself. I just wanted to share this experience, and a lot of things started moving. I quit my corporate job at the end. I decided never to work for anyone else, which didn't quite happen. I did have another job later on, but it was the beginning of my entrepreneurial journey and my personal development. I started, discovering the world. I remember that I always wanted to own my own business. I basically started remembering things because my corporate job had taken me so much off track that I had forgotten who I was. Or what I was even dreaming of. And when I started healing the trauma and coming back to my true self, I started remembering who I was, what I wanted to do with my life. And the first thing I remembered was that I never wanted to work for anyone. I always wanted to have my own business, run my own thing, be my own boss and my own manager. Again, very typical for ADHD. We kind of have to do that because it's our DNA, quote unquote DNA. So I started remembering all these things. So I quit my job, decided never to work for anyone again. And I started my first startup, which was to connect therapists and coaches to clients. I worked for that on a year. And that here you can already see the ADHD path. It was a lot of discovery, a lot of changes until I found today what I truly want to do. And I'm still calibrating, but I finally found what I truly want to do, which is be a therapist, help other people overcome trauma, and also help other therapists help their clients better through marketing and business strategy. But at the time, that was about 4 years ago now, it wasn't quite clear because I had spent about 30 years following someone else's ideas of what I should be doing. So how can I possibly know what I want fully if, when I had never actually allowed myself to explore it? And a lot of people spend a lifetime not knowing what they want. So I actually feel quite privileged that I had this midlife crisis at the age of 30, and I actually found my true path. So this is my story basically. And after my first startup, I even went into other directions. I was an actress for for about 6 months or a year, and then I realized that actually I miss business. I mean, all this creativity. I started exploring my creativity and stuff, which was great. But then I missed business, so I went back to what I'm doing now. And now I'm combining all of these things by helping others, but also by working business and marketing and doing creative things as well, such as writing and videos and things like that. So that path, and I'm sharing this with you because I think when you work, and especially when you work with kids, you have to allow them to explore who they really are. There's a great story about this little girl who, this is completely off my preparation for this presentation. I just remember that. There's this great story, this little girl who was doing so bad at school. She couldn't, she couldn't sit still. She couldn't focus on any subject. And teachers were obviously trying, I think it was a few decades ago, were trying to pigeonhole her, were trying to make her, study. And then someone noticed that she was just what she was doing when she was being restless. She was dancing, and they supported her in that gift, and she actually became a great dancer. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but what ADHD essentially is to me is creativity and a genius in a specific area. And when you work with kids, you need to allow that genius to come out in whatever area that is. And often the school system does not quite allow for that, because there's a certain range of subjects and we study and things we do, and we don't really work with kids individually. I mean, maybe, I guess we do now, and in some places more than others, but it's really important to allow that. And what ADHD is great passion for certain things and a complete disinterest in everything else, including everyday kind of normal things and sort of boring things as well. Like most people, neurotypical, let's use that medical term, neurotypical people, and for those of you who are not that familiar with ADHD, things such as ADHD, the autistic spectrum, dyslexia, and all those things are now coined neurodiverse, meaning not neurotypicals, or people who have a different sort of neural wiring. So neurotypical people can handle like everyday things that are boring, that are not so interesting, where people with ADHD just don't want to do it and find it very difficult to handle that. Now, there's a lot I could talk about ADHD and this and that for 3 hours and cover all these different aspects. But obviously that's going to take a long time. So I've kind of focused this on what I consider to be the most important things, and we'll see what that is in a moment. But yeah, coming back to my story. So after I quit my corporate job, I had a bit of exploration, going through acting, creativity, owning my first startup, not quitting that, essentially realizing that I couldn't do it on my own and not having the right team, and running out of money, being completely broke at some point, sleeping on friends' couches, and doing the whole entrepreneurial journey, then rejoining entrepreneurial circles, getting a lot of support from people, and until I started to coach. I learned a lot about marketing, starting supporting other people in marketing, entrepreneurs, and then specifically coaches and therapists. And then last year, actually November 2020, I realized that I could be a therapist myself. So I graduated in RTT, rapid transformational therapy. Now I also practice EFT, emotional freedom technique, and I absolutely love that. But it took me 5 years to understand and have the belief that I could do that myself as well, and I don't have to just connect therapists to clients. So that comes down to confidence, and again, knowing yourself and your strengths and what you're good at. So the sooner you find that out, the sooner you would be living the life of your dreams, and the sooner you help, say, children find that for themselves, the sooner they will be happy. And the more you try to pigeonhole them into something they're not happy with, the longer they'll suffer. Basically, that's important for anyone. as I'm sure you guys all know, I'm sure, and I think all of you guys probably have children, and you know that's important for anyone, but for people with ADHD, it's just so much more important to understand that early on. One of the reasons is that people with ADHD tend to be very sensitive as well. And so trauma tends to happen a little bit more easily. Now, some say that sensitivity is also, you know, a learned, not a learned behavior, but I think that happens in development. Whether that's true or not, or we're born with a certain level of sensitivity, I don't know. I'm guessing it's a combination of the two. It's a combination of environment and neurowiring and genes. It's just so much more important for people with ADHD to discover who they really are early on, and to celebrate that, and to endorse that, because like little things can affect them a lot more than other people, because they tend to be more we tend to be more sensitive. That's why ADHD often goes with creativity, with sensitivity. All these things go hand in hand, like very, very often. And having been in the acting world, I strongly believe that most people in the creative industry have some form of ADHD or leaning towards ADHD. So to me, it's not a disorder, it's a combination of symptoms. So let's look at the symptoms now. Actually, before that, I wanted to share something with you. ADHD, also people with ADHD have a tendency to be for hyper focus. What that means is essentially what we call being in the flow, being so absorbed that you forget everything around you. Or as another dictionary definition put it, it means basically a state in which you're so fully immersed, a feeling of energized focus, full involvement, enjoyment in the process or the activity. We all can do that. We all can be in the flow. But what people with ADHD tend to do, they jump from subject to subject to subject to subject until they find something they're truly interested in, and then they forget about the rest of the world, and then they become truly absorbed, more so than so-called neurotypical people. And again, so ADHD is a spectrum. I don't like the word disorder, but that's how it's defined to be, meaning there's a combination, there are certain symptoms, and we're going to go to that in a second, and you can have more or less of all of those symptoms. So you have a tendency to get distracted more or less. So there's a different degree to which you may experience those symptoms. That's, you know, for those of you wondering if you have it or may have it, you know, there are degrees to it. And so many people who have never been diagnosed, have not even thought about being diagnosed, may have it to an extent. Okay. So hyperfocus is the ability to be so absorbed in something that you completely forget about everything around you. And that's when you can be truly effective. So actually, when you find what you're truly passionate about, that's what tends to happen to you. And that's why, in my opinion, ADHD is genius in disguise. And that's shown by many famous ADHD people. Now, a lot of these people are historical figures, and probably ADHD didn't exist as a disorder, didn't exist in the DSM at the time. I think even the DSM didn't exist until, I'm not quite sure, to be honest, when it was first created, but it was not so long ago. But these people are said to have the symptoms of ADHD, and you can see Thomas Edison. So Richard Branson is officially diagnosed, and I think he's quite proud of it. And he actually has a very interesting story. He talks about how how it affected him, and he also had dyslexia. So it's really, really interesting story if you want to look him up, and how he talks about his ADHD and dyslexia. Justin Timberlake, I put that here just for fun. As I said, I think a lot of creative people, if not everyone, have it to a certain extent or another. President Lincoln, Albert Einstein, Leonardo da Vinci, Scott Fitzgerald, the writer. So all of these people, just a small sample of famous people, whether they're historical figures, politicians, musicians, you know, creative people, who officially have it or have been would have had it if someone wanted to diagnose them. And you will notice that all of these people have dedicated their lives, or at least their professions, to a certain area they're really good at. They didn't try to be good at everything. They didn't try to be good at math when they're not, or music or dance when they're not. They knew what they're good at, and they dedicate their lives to that with tenacity and persistence. And this is what makes you great as a person with ADHD. Just stop trying to fit in and stop trying to be normal, because it's ADHD's creativity and genius in disguise. That's my opinion, and I strongly believe that. And when you heal the disguise, you allow genius to come out. And you can, feel free to disagree with me, but this is what I believe today. Okay, so let's have an overview of the symptoms.
Dia, I'm sorry, I have to leave now. I have an appointment.
Okay.
Would you please send me the recording?
Yes, sure, I will do.
Thank you very much.
Hope you liked it so far. Have a great day and see you later.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think Jill was interested in the symptoms. She has to leave. That's unfortunate, but I'm sure she can see the recording. So what is ADHD? So there are two types of ADHD, as I know most of you guys know that, but let's go through them quickly. So there's the inattentive type, which tends to be the calm kids, probably the A student, the calm kid in the corner, the one that's kind of dazed out and spaced out and kind of dazed and confused, but it doesn't create any trouble, so it's much more difficult to spot. And then there's the hyperactive kid, who creates a lot of, usually a lot of trouble for its core at home. So the hyperactive type tends to, I'll just go through them really quickly: fidget, tap hands or feet, squirms in the seat, leaves seats in situation where remaining sitting expected. That also happens in meetings and at work a lot. Experiences feelings of restlessness, has difficulty engaging in quiet leisurely activities, is on the go or acts as if driven by motor, talks excessively, blurts out answers, has difficulty waiting their turn, interrupts and intrudes on others. Now, I didn't put this here on the slides, but you guys all as specialists, I think all but Maria, all of you guys are therapists, you know the symptoms of trauma and PTSD, and you may find a lot of similarities between the two. So this restlessness, this being on the go, this being as if driven, well, maybe not driven by motor in the case of trauma necessarily, but this restlessness and kind of alertness is very similar in some ways. And it's basically, to me, is this a constant state of fight or flight, this inner restlessness. Yeah. Okay, let's look at the inattentive type. So difficult sustaining attention, makes careless mistakes, lacks attention to detail, does not seem to listen when spoken to, fails to follow through, exhibiting poor organization, avoiding tasks requiring sustained mental effort. I would add getting bored easily, starting things but not finishing things. That's actually on the diagnostic test. Loses things necessary for tasks and activities, easily distracted, included unrelated thoughts, is forgetful in daily activities. Okay, sounds harsh. So I'm sure that all of you guys, even the ones that don't have ADHD here, have experienced some of these things some of the time, right? So all of us have experienced these things, but it's about the extent to which they bother us, or they kind of create trouble in everyday life. So to me, ADHD is a combination of symptoms that are then given a diagnosis, which may initially be helpful, especially when you're an adult. When you're an adult and you spend 30, 40 years making careless mistakes, making impulsive decisions, not knowing why this happened, forgetting things, creating problems in relationships because your you said something inappropriate, because you talked over the other person and I just got sick of it, because you talked in meetings and maybe you got fired or got in trouble at work, because you forgot to keep up with appointments and people thought you just didn't care about them. The list goes on and on and on and on. When you have a lifetime of this and you suddenly get diagnosed with ADHD, with adult ADHD, it can be very eye-opening. To me, it explained my whole life. It made sense. All the impulsivity, the careless kind of mistakes and forgetting things, even have forgotten things that are quite important that had major consequences, as Dave knows from our session the other day, which again created that feeling of shame, guilt, trauma, and sort of worry, and often create, let's use that morbid word, comorbid conditions such as anxiety and depression. Ooh, hard stuff. So anxiety, depression very often come hand in hand with ADHD, especially in people who have a tendency to beat themselves up for things, who tendency to kind of put the blame on themselves. And that usually, as we know, comes from, parents or childhood in which you have been, the blame has been put on you, you've been criticized a lot and so on and so forth. And you have a tendency to internalize everything because that's, that is what you do. In my experience, that's not a statistic, it's my experience that people with the inattentive type tend to be mostly women, mostly girls or women. And they tend to be the ones that internalize as well, and they tend to be more prone to anxiety, depression, whereas the hyperactive type are more the outgoing type, the externalizing type, and they're the type who says, well, I don't care, I forgot about our meeting, I just forgot. And, they don't put the blame on themselves. They just don't know what happened to them, and they just keep going and go on to the next job that gets them fired, so they tend to externalize the situation. Okay, I see a lot of comments here, but I'll check them later. So let's go on. These are the common symptoms. Again, these are symptoms that, we all have, but it's the extent to which we have them. And often it's the so-called comorbid conditions such as anxiety, depression that leads us to be diagnosed, or maybe somebody suggests that maybe because we forget all the time, we should get a diagnosis. And in my opinion, a diagnosis is helpful initially, but it's not something to live by. You have to move beyond it. I have friends, I know people who say, I have ADHD and sorry, I forgot, Great. It's great to say that to create an understanding in others, but not to use it as an excuse. So to not use your diagnosis as an excuse, because a lot of the symptoms can be relieved. And we need to heal the disguise, so to speak, to let the genius come out. A lot of these symptoms can be relieved. I've seen it happen. I've seen it in me. Yes, I still forget. Yes, I left this presentation till the very last minute, till I had to get it done. Actually, I did a lot before because it is my passion, but the actual presentation, even though I knew I should put more effort in putting the slides together and so on, I left at the very last minute. And that's the thing with ADHD. The things that you enjoy, you will do and be hyper focused on them. The things that you don't enjoy so much, you leave them for last. But again, there are solutions to this. So this is what I think needs to happen. First, you heal the trauma. What does that mean? You guys are all therapists. I think Maria is the only person we have here who is not. So for Maria and everyone else, everything that we experience as a reaction to others, anything that we cannot accept in ourselves or in others, anger issues, addictions, anything, these are just symptoms of a deeply held usually deeply held trauma. It could be a trauma from your adulthood, but typically it's trauma from childhood. Whether it doesn't mean it's always your parents' fault, or it's always the parents' fault, or it's your fault if your children have these symptoms. No, it's just, it could be, it could be the school environment. I actually spoke to someone recently whose son has ADHD, and she said it's a school environment who's not very understanding of, his kind of uniqueness. So that can happen. Bad parenting can happen as well, or things such as, see, I missed that slide. Things such as abuse, trauma, being adopted, changing hands, having a lot of conflict in the family, having a lot of, even just arguments between the parents can create ADHD, because what happens is the world stops to make sense. There's this conflict of different ideas and beliefs, and it's all basically a mess. Your brain gets accustomed to a mess, and it also fails to develop properly, because for our bodies to heal and for our brains to develop properly, we need to have peace of mind. We need to have love and attention. And you guys who work with the autistic spectrum know that all the autistic disorders, including ADHD, the symptoms are alleviated when the child gets more attention and love. Yeah, put in the chat box if you agree with that. So we all need enough attention and love, and probably people with ADHD tendencies even more so. But if we don't get it in childhood, we need to heal that trauma that was created, and that can take some time, because when you peel one layer of the onion, usually another one appears, and you need to heal that too. But it definitely can be done. As we'll see later, some of the symptoms in relationships. One of the symptoms is anger, anger outbursts, and anger, as we know, is nothing but suppressed hurt and pain. And when that suppressed hurt and pain gets healed, gets reframed in our minds or let go of, then the anger will naturally disappear. I've seen it and I have experience with it personally as well. So secondly, you adopt practices, or put coaching practices, so practices to manage your distractibility and forgetfulness. You can have a calendar to put down all of your appointments, including when to call your mom and when to do your shopping and what your shopping list is. Just put things down, because the tendency to forget is probably something that may linger for a little bit, even if you heal the past trauma. So just have these things in place. I have an assistant who, for very important things, I tell her to, I don't only put in my calendar, but I tell her to remind me. She's very organized. She's very neurotypical. And that's what an ADHD person needs. Either a partner, like a husband or wife, or an assistant or a family member, a good friend who's very organized and helps them to remember things they need to remember. And thirdly, consider medication as a temporary crutch. Don't be dependent on it. That's my opinion. There are different opinions on medications. So just to mention, before I got off the antidepressants within a year after being prescribed them, I stopped taking Ritalin also 4 years ago, because although it felt great and it gave me this high and focus on everything, I just didn't want to be dependent on it. And also there's a thing with medication, and I'm coming to that now, that it may make you very focused, but on the wrong thing. So you have to kind of be, I'm not quite sure how to tackle that, but many people report that, yes, it makes them focused, but it may as well be on the wrong thing. In kids, I heard great results. They do tend to focus, but do you really want your child or your students or your coaches to be kind of tamed, so that they no longer focus on what they're truly good at and what their passion is, but so that they can fit in? I don't agree with that. But maybe some medication, at least temporarily, may be useful, just to be able to deal with everyday life, with school or with your work if you're an adult, and so on. So different types of medication: short-lasting Adderall, Ritalin, SR is the intermediate, long-lasting Vivance, Concerta. These are just some of the most common examples, but there are many options, right? They are essentially a stimulant medication which boosts dopamine and norepinephrine, and essentially in people with ADHD, one of the theories is that there's a not sufficient amount of dopamine, which is why we're not motivated enough to do something that is boring. And why we have a tendency to hyperfocus, it's a different story. But yeah, essentially we lack without going into neuroscience, dopamine is considered to be not enough, or also there are different parts of the brain that get triggered differently to neurotypical people. But yeah, this medication is based on the theory that dopamine is essentially not enough in people with ADHD. So ADHD in relationships, and this is coming out to be a bit longer than I planned it to. But I'll open the floor for discussion for about 10 minutes, because I know some of you have to go in 15 minutes, so we'll make sure we finish by then. So again, many people with ADHD have gone through abuse, being adopted, neglected, witnessed arguments, and so on. The world didn't make sense. The brain got confused. It's a constant state of fight or flight, constant stress. And in times of stress, our bodies do not heal and our brains do not develop properly. You need to be in a peaceful state of mind for your body to heal. And also something very interesting that someone opened my mind to recently, the stress levels or the cortisol levels need to go down in order for the dopamine and serotonin, especially dopamine, to flow properly, or to be increased. So when you remove the stress, you increase all the good hormones that you want, neurotransmitters that you want for your proper functioning. Also, when it comes to relationship, trust was often broken because of abuse, neglect, etc. So it creates a lot of issues with trust in relationships. People with ADHD often have poor self-esteem, inflated sense of ego, craving attention, or shying away from attention. It could be one way or the other. They have a lot of shame, guilt from past mistakes or their own impulsive decisions. Okay, so here, I'm not going to read all of this because it's quite long and we're running out of time, but essentially, this says that an ADHD person in a relationship may initially have, because of the hyperfocus, focus very much on their partner and then shift their attention away from the partner, making the partner feel neglected. What does that look like? It looks a little bit narcissistic. A narcissist will typically love bomb someone and then withdraw their attention. So again, if you happen to be in a relationship with someone who gives you a lot of attention, then withdraws it, then you don't know what's going on, it's kind of all up and down, before diagnosing it as maybe a narcissistic relationship, then explore this possibility that maybe they have ADHD tendencies. Okay, so what's the result of all this trauma that ADHD people go through? They're highly sensitive, they have difficulty trusting others, difficulty keeping up with appointments, so they get in trouble at work and in personal life. They start lying, or they have sensitivity to being lied to. I know people who are like that. I'm definitely like that, and even more so in the past. You can spot lies, from afar, and that's could be also because of the environment that you grew up in. So whether that's a natural tendency or the result of a trauma that you've experienced, again, there is no specific data on that. And as someone here suggested, it tend to be kind of ego driven, which kind of makes sense. When you haven't had the proper attention growing up, when you experience trauma, you always crave that attention. So of course you're very, very ego focused. So when it comes to relationships, the solution is to heal the trauma, which will indeed make you less ego driven, and sort of when you start coming back to your true self and more centered, you naturally heal that understanding. I'm actually really tempted to make a follow-up of this webinar because there's so much more to be covered here, and I do apologize for kind of not covering everything, because it's my first one on ADHD and relationships, actually my first one on ADHD ever. But what comes to me at the moment is ADHD is so often seen in people with attachment disorders. So attachment disorder, just really briefly, because I know most of you know what that is the insecure attachment or attachment disorders essentially means that you don't develop the proper attachment growing up. Again, it can come from people who are not consistently there, and parents who are missing, abusive, neglecting. All of these issues create attachment, insecure attachment, which of course leads to trouble in relationships. So the combination of that and the combination of ADHD symptoms such as missing appointments, forgetting things, potentially the insecure attachment style, which again leads to lack of trust and doubting the relationship, it can create a lot of issues. And the answer to all of these things is very simple: is healing those issues, is healing the trauma, understanding where it comes from, and letting and creating that mature adult when you heal the child. So heal the child and the mature adult will appear. The brain always changes, always develops, as we know. So those new connections can be made. You know, heal, it can be done is my new motto, and I absolutely believe that. But you also need to, while in the process of healing or before you've started that journey, you need to get understanding from your partner, family, and relatives if you have ADHD, but also show understanding, not just say, well, I have ADHD and they should understand me. That's true, but also you need to understand them, because it's not easy for them as well. It's not easy for them either. Do you know how I know that? Because the more I know that because the more I heal from my past and the more I kind of let go of the ADHD symptoms, the more I lean towards a neurotypical person, the more I become organized and so on and so forth. And I notice in people who are completely all over the place still, I start to get a little bit irritated, and it's not easy. It's not easy. It's not easy on either side. So you need to have understanding from both sides, not just say I have ADHD, they should be understanding. No, that's never the case. Understanding comes from both sides, and take responsibility for your own healing if you have ADHD, or help people take responsibility for their own healing if you're working with someone with ADHD. It's not their fault that trauma happened, but it's their responsibility for their sake, for their partner's sake, and for their children's sake, especially to heal. Because people with a lot of trauma will also create inevitably traumatized children. So it is our responsibility to heal for our own sake and for everybody else as well. So that's the overview of ADHD and ADHD in relationships specifically.